I was on my own beach when she told me to leave it. That's where this starts. Not with a letter, not with a notice in my mailbox. It starts with me standing at the edge of the water on a Tuesday morning, holding a cup of coffee, watching the bay go gold, and a woman I'd never met walking toward me like I was the problem. She had someone with her, a man maybe 60, carrying a clipboard. She was already talking before she was close enough to shake hands.
You need to leave this area immediately. This beach is HOA property.
No introduction, no good morning, just a pointed finger and a voice that had clearly never been told no. I looked at her. Then I looked at the sign she'd zip-tied to a metal post in the sand. White laminated card, bold black print, HOA Beach, authorized residents only. The post was sunk 4 feet from where I was standing. My sand, my soil. I own this cabin, I said. I'm on my own property. That doesn't give you private access to community waterfront. You're trespassing. We have 96 homeowners whose beach access you are currently blocking. Then she raised her phone and photographed me. No warning, no permission, just the click of a camera right in my face. I didn't move. I set my coffee down on the dock post beside me and looked at her, quietly, carefully. Inside, something had already settled into place, a cold, specific kind of recognition. I'd seen this before, not with an HOA, but I knew what a bluff looked like when it came dressed up in a lanyard. Can I see the deed that transferred this strip to the HOA? I asked. I don't need to show you anything. She was already dialing. I heard her tell the dispatcher, yes, I need an officer at Bayside HOA. We have a man refusing to leave HOA community property. He's been asked multiple times to leave and is refusing to comply. She said it loudly, deliberately, eyes on me the entire time. That was the moment. The exact moment she stopped being my problem and started being her own. She had no idea that the old cabin by the bay came with a deed that would make her call to 911, the single most expensive mistake this HOA had ever made. I waited. The bay did what the bay does. A heron worked the shallows about 30 yards out, slow and unbothered. The man with the clipboard had gone quiet. He was studying the horizon like it owed him something. The officers arrived 11 minutes later. 2 of them. Karen, that's what I'd started calling her in my head because a formal introduction never came, walked out to meet them at the grass line, with the energy of someone who had run this play before and expected the same result every time. She pointed at me. She explained the situation using the phrase, "our beach," 4 times in under 2 minutes. One officer was taking notes. The other, younger, moved carefully, had the kind of eyes that registered more than they let on, looked at the laminated sign, then at the cabin behind me. Then at Karen. Something passed across his face that I filed away. They walked over to me. Sir, can you explain your presence here and your relationship to this property? I had one thing with me that morning. I'd brought it deliberately, a manila envelope from the title company, the kind they hand you at closing. I held it at my side but didn't open it. Not yet. I bought this cabin 6 weeks ago, I said. I live here. That's my coffee on that post. The younger officer looked at the sign again. The post it was zip-tied to had been driven into soil that, according to every document inside the envelope under my arm, sat inside the recorded boundaries of my lot. Bayshore Access Parcel B, deeded to this cabin in 1963, before this HOA existed, before half the houses in this development were built. I didn't say any of that yet. Karen was talking again. A 96 homeowners community amenity and maintenance agreement from 1998 that she said had transferred ownership of the entire waterfront strip to the association. The officer with the notepad kept writing. The clipboard man had drifted 2 full steps back, as though he was trying to quietly remember where he'd parked. I watched Karen's hands. They were moving fast now, sketching shapes in the air, drawing borders that existed in her version of events and nowhere in the county record. The envelope stayed under my arm. I wasn't in a hurry. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, that Tuesday morning, was what that old deed actually said about this beach, and neither did the officers. Yet. Let me back up. 6 weeks before that morning on the beach, I wasn't thinking about HOA bylaws, or laminated signs, or a woman named Margaret. I was thinking about the price. The listing said vintage waterfront cabin, original structure, motivated seller. The photograph showed a low wooden building with a screened porch facing the bay, old pine boards, a dock with 2 missing planks, and a view that would have cost 3 times as much anywhere else on that coastline. The price was low enough that I called the agent that same afternoon. I wasn't sentimental about it. I did a title search, verified the property lines, ran the deed against county records, and made an offer. The cabin had been in the same family since 1963, built by the original developer, passed down, never refinanced, never modified. When the estate finally sold it, they sold it the same way it had always existed. Original deed, original structure, no amendments, no addenda. That detail would matter more than I knew at the time. I moved in on a Saturday in early spring, the kind of day that makes coastal property feel like a reasonable decision. The porch screen had a long diagonal tear in it. The dock groaned. The bay looked like hammered copper in the afternoon light. By the following Thursday, I had a notice in my mailbox. $75. Violation. Improper storage of watercraft/recreational equipment in non-designated area. My canoe. It was leaning against the side of the cabin, where it had been since the day I moved in, tucked against the wall under the eave out of the weather, not blocking anything, not visible from the street. Along with the notice was a plastic-wrapped copy of the HOA rulebook, 47 pages. I made a cup of coffee and read all of it. On page 31, under Community Amenities and Common Areas, the beach was listed as a common recreational area available to all residents and their guests, subject to HOA regulation. There was no deed citation, no recorded instrument reference, no legal basis given at all. It read the way a thing reads when someone decided it was true and typed it up and hoped no one would ask follow-up questions. I noted it. I didn't do anything with it yet. My neighbor across the gravel path, a man named Arthur, 71 years old, who had lived in his house since 1993, came by that first weekend with a jar of honey from someone down the road, and the cautious energy of a man choosing his words with care. We talked about the bay, about fishing, about the heron that worked the same stretch of shallows every morning. Then as he was leaving, he turned back. "Just be careful with Margaret," he said. That was it. He didn't explain further. He walked back across the path with the practiced ease of someone who had learned that certain conversations were better left on the porch. Margaret. I found out more over the following 2 weeks, in the way you find things out in a neighborhood, incrementally, from people who talked in careful fractions. Margaret had been president of the HOA board for 9 years. Before her, people told me it had been a different kind of place. Loose, neighborly. The kind of HOA that existed mostly to split the cost of landscaping the front entrance and argue gently about holiday decorations. Then Margaret was elected and the enforcement committee appeared. Then the fine schedule. Then the compliance photography. She walked the development herself, twice a week with a phone and a clipboard documenting violations. Front yard dimensions measured against bylaw minimums. Fences checked for approved color codes. Vehicles logged for registration sticker compliance. The HOA budget had tripled in 9 years. I asked a few people where that money went. They gave me the kind of answer that isn't really an answer, references to legal expenses and maintenance reserves that nobody could explain in specific terms. What nobody said out loud, but what hung over every conversation like a low ceiling, was this: people were afraid of her. Not dramatically afraid, not hiding in their houses afraid. Just the quiet, grinding kind of afraid that comes from watching someone use a fine schedule the way other people use a leash. Arthur wasn't the only one who'd been fined. An older couple 2 houses down the marshes, both retired in their late 70s, had accumulated over $4,000 in fines over the past 3 years for things they couldn't fully articulate when I asked. Something about the beach, something about using the dock. They'd been paying because they didn't know what else to do, and because Margaret had a habit of mentioning foreclosure the way other people mention the weather. The waterfront strip ran behind 12 properties in the development, mine included. All 12 had been built in the 1960s as part of the original subdivision. Back then, each lot came with its own recorded access to the beach, private specific, written into each individual deed. At some point in the mid-1990s, the HOA had installed a shared dock, set out picnic benches, posted a use schedule. The individual owners hadn't fought it. Most of them by now didn't even remember the original terms of what they owned. My cabin was different. It had never been refinanced, never had an HOA addendum attached. The deed had never been re-recorded under new terms. The same document that had been filed in 1963 was the document that existed today, and whatever it said it the same way it had always said it, without revision or amendment, or the quiet pressure of a signature on a form most people don't read carefully. I didn't know the full significance of that yet, but I put the 47-page rulebook on the kitchen table next to the canoe notice open to page 31, and I sat with it for a while. Then I decided I needed to visit the county recorder's office. 10 days after the canoe notice, I went for a swim. Nothing dramatic about it. Early morning before the heat settled in, I walked down to the waterfront, left my shoes on the dock, and got in the water. The bay was cold and clear, and nobody else was using it. I swam out maybe 100 yards, floated for a while, and came back. Margaret was waiting on the beach when I got out. This time, she was alone. No clipboard man, just her, standing at the edge of the sand in pressed khakis and a polo with the HOA logo embroidered on the chest, holding a single sheet of paper, the way a person holds something they've been rehearsing. She held it out to me before I'd even picked up my towel. I took it, shook the water off my hand first, then read it. Violation notice. Unauthorized use of HOA, Community Waterfront Bylaw, 14.3. Fine $500. Payment due within 30 days. I looked up. Can you show me the deed or legal instrument that transferred this waterfront to the HOA? Something shifted behind her eyes. The bureaucratic composure cracked just slightly, not into uncertainty, but into a harder, colder register. That's not how this works, she said. The HOA owns this beach. It's in the bylaws. You signed the disclosure when you purchased the property. I did, I said. The disclosure references the bylaws. The bylaws reference a deed. I'd like to see that deed. What you'd like is irrelevant. What matters is that you are in violation of community rules, and you have 30 days to pay the fine, or this becomes a board matter. I stood there in wet swim trunks holding her notice, and I thought about the 47-page rulebook on my kitchen table, and the non-answer on page 31. I thought about how she'd said, the HOA owns this beach, with exactly the same tone someone uses when they say, the sky is blue, like a thing so self-evident that asking for documentation was itself an act of aggression. I'd still like to see the deed, I said. That's when she stopped pretending the conversation was about rules. If you continue to violate community standards, she said, we will file a lien on your property. We have the authority to do that, and we have done it before. She let that land. Then, one homeowner in this development lost his house over unpaid fines. I'm not saying that to be unkind. I'm saying it because you should understand what you're choosing to engage with here. You could owe this association up to $10,000 before this is resolved. $10,000, said flatly like a courtesy. I nodded slowly. I appreciate you being direct, I said. I'll be in touch. She left. The heron was working the shallows again. 30 yards out, operating at its own pace, unbothered by any of it. I went inside, dried off, and sat at the kitchen table. What I knew at that moment, she had threatened me with a lien, a legal instrument that clouds your property title and can, in the right circumstances, lead to forced sale. That part was real. That part she could actually do, if she had the legal standing to levy fines in the first place. What I didn't know yet, whether she had that standing at all. What I suspected based on 30 minutes with a 47-page rulebook and a citation to a common area with no legal instrument behind it, she didn't. So I did what you do when someone threatens you with a weapon they may not actually own. I asked to see it in writing. I spent that evening drafting a formal letter to the HOA board. Certified mail return receipt requested. The letter asked 3 specific things to be provided within 14 days. First, the recorded deed or title instrument demonstrating HOA ownership of the waterfront strip. Second, the board resolution authorizing fines under bylaw 14.3. Third, the recorded subdivision plat showing the beach designated as common area. 14 days was reasonable. 14 days was more than enough time to produce a document that should have been easy to find if it existed. I signed the letter, sealed it, and drove to the post office that night. Arthur was on his porch when I came back. He watched Karen's direction for a moment, then walked across the gravel path. She came by today, I said. I know, he said. I saw. He was quiet for a moment. Then, she sent 3 families out of this development with those fines. Good people. People who'd lived here longer than she has. He looked at me carefully. Don't let her do that to you. He reached into his shirt pocket and handed me a folded piece of paper, a name and a phone number, a title company, he said, that had handled the original land transactions for this development back in the 60s. They might still have the records, he said, the original ones, before any of this. I thanked him. He nodded, and walked back across the path without another word. I stood in the driveway for a minute looking at the piece of paper. Then I went inside and put it next to the rule book and the fine notice and the copy of my certified letter. 14 days. She had 14 days to show me a deed. She never did. But she did do something else. She had her attorney send me a letter instead, and that letter told me exactly how weak her case really was. The county recorder's office was in a low brick building downtown, the kind of place that smelled like carpet and old paper and hadn't been renovated since before Margaret discovered the fine schedule. I got there when it opened. I pulled 3 things that morning. The first was the original deed for my cabin, recorded 1963 under the original developer's name. The clerk ran it through the microfiche reader without ceremony and handed me a printout. I sat at one of the reading tables and went through it line by line. I found the clause on the second page. Lot 7, together with riparian rights and exclusive access to the waterfront strip designated herein as Bayshore Access, Parcel B. I read it twice, then a third time. Riparian rights, exclusive access, Bayshore Access Parcel B. Not vague, not implied. Specific, recorded, legally binding language filed with this county in 1963, attached to my lot, never amended, never waived, never modified. I set the printout down and sat with it for a moment. Not triumph, not yet. Just the specific cold satisfaction of a suspicion confirmed in ink. The second thing was the original subdivision plat from the 1960s, the master map filed when the first lots were sold. I spread it across the table. Bayshore Access Parcel B appeared clearly a private access strip, designated per individual lot deeds, not shaded as common area, not labeled as HOA property, a private strip belonging to the lots it was deeded to. I held the 47-page rulebook next to it, page 31, the beach as a common recreational area. The plat didn't support that, not even close. The third thing was the HOA's founding declaration, recorded in 1994. I found the section on common areas. The language said the HOA would govern common areas as designated in the plat. The same plat I was looking at. The plat that did not designate Bayshore Access Parcel B as anything other than private lot access. The HOA had built 9 years of fines and enforcement on a declaration that pointed back to a document that contradicted everything they claimed. They had declared the beach theirs in their internal documents, but their own founding charter had handed me the crowbar. I made copies of everything. The title company Arthur had mentioned confirmed the same records when I called them that afternoon. Their original files matched the county filing exactly, unchanged since the first sales. I drove home and kept going 4 houses down. Eleanor had been in the development since 1991. Arthur had mentioned her name when I'd asked about the other original waterfront lot owners. She answered the door like she'd been half expecting someone to knock. She put tea on without asking and set a manila folder on the table before I'd explained why I'd come. I figured someone would eventually, she said. The folder held her copy of the 1998 agreement, the document Margaret had been describing in increasingly confident terms as the HOA's ownership basis for the waterfront. What Karen's predecessor had circulated to all 12 original waterfront lot owners and asked them to sign. I read it at Eleanor's kitchen table. This agreement grants the Homeowners Association of Record the right to maintain, manage, and schedule use of the shared waterfront pathway and dock facilities for purposes of community access. This agreement constitutes a maintenance and management arrangement only, and does not constitute, imply, or affect a transfer of ownership of any property interest in the designated waterfront parcels. Maintenance and management only, not a transfer of ownership. The document said so explicitly in plain language in the second paragraph. Eleanor had not signed it. Most of her neighbors had. She'd read it carefully at the time and decided she didn't need to give the HOA management authority over land she already owned outright. The copy had been in a filing cabinet for 26 years. "Does Margaret know you have this?" I asked. Eleanor looked at me over her tea. "Margaret has never once asked me about it. I don't think it occurred to her that anyone would keep something that old." She walked me to the door and stopped me on the porch. "The Marshes have been paying fines for 3 years, she said quietly, "for using their own beach. They're frightened of her." A pause. "Whatever you're doing, don't stop." That afternoon I called a real estate attorney. 1 hour, flat fee. I spread the documents across his conference table and let him read without interruption. He wrote me a one-page letter. The relevant line, the 1963 deed language, is unambiguous. The HOA has no recorded ownership interest in Bayshore Access Parcel B. Their enforcement of fines related to this parcel has no legal basis. I drove home as the light went low across the water, walked down to the beach and sat in the sand with the folder in my lap. No coffee, just the bay and the heron working the shallows, and the quiet knowledge of what I was holding. I knew what I had. I knew what she didn't have. I wasn't going to move yet. Margaret was going to give me the right arena. People like her always do. I came home on a Wednesday afternoon to find 2 metal posts driven into my beach. Not near my beach. Not at the edge of some disputed boundary. Into the sand and soil of Bayshore Access Parcel B, my deeded waterfront recorded with the county since 1963, with post-hole hardware sunk 8 inches deep into ground that belonged to me by every legal measure I had spent the past 3 weeks confirming. Zip-tied to each post a laminated sign, "No trespassing, HOA property." I stood at the top of the dock steps and looked at them for a long moment. I didn't move. I didn't touch anything. Then I went back inside and got my phone. I photographed everything before I disturbed a single grain of sand. Sign placement both posts, the hardware at the base, the post holes themselves. I turned on GPS tagging and walked the lot line, photographing where the post stood relative to the recorded boundary markers. I took a wide shot from the cabin porch, showing the signs in context. My structure, my dock, my lot, their posts. I took close-ups of the zip ties, the laminate, the hardware. I photographed the soil displacement around each post hole, the fresh-turned earth that told me exactly how recently they'd been installed. Then I went back inside and left the signs exactly where they were. The mail had come while I was at work. Underneath the usual stack was a letter from an attorney's office. HOA letterhead law firm name in the upper right corner. Formal language beginning with, "Dear property owner." I sat at the kitchen table and read it. The HOA was formally initiating a lien on my property. Accrued fines $2,850. Payment demanded within 30 days, or the lien would be recorded against my title. That was the first paragraph. The second paragraph was the one that mattered. The waterfront strip adjacent to your property was transferred to HOA common ownership via recorded agreement in 1998. Establishing the association's legal authority over all waterfront access and use within the development. Transferred to HOA common ownership via recorded agreement in 1998. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I got up, opened the filing cabinet in the second bedroom, and pulled out Eleanor's copy of the 1998 document. I set it on the table next to the attorney's letter. The attorney's letter said, "Transferred to HOA common ownership." The 1998 document said, "This agreement constitutes a maintenance and management arrangement only and does not constitute, imply, or affect a transfer of ownership of any property interest in the designated waterfront parcels." Same document, same year, completely opposite meaning. This wasn't a gray area. This wasn't a matter of interpretation or competing legal theories. The HOA's attorney had written to me under their letterhead and described a document as saying something it explicitly, unambiguously, did not say. I photographed both documents side by side on the kitchen table. Attorney letter on the left, the actual 1998 agreement on the right. The relevant language visible in both frames. Then I called Eleanor. She already knew about the signs. She'd seen the work crew that morning. 2 men with a post hole digger, working quickly, no announcement. She'd watched from her kitchen window and written down the time. I asked her about the marshes, whether they were still in the development, whether she thought they'd talk to me. "They're still here," she said. "But Ruth cried the last time their fine notice came. They think they owe that money. They've thought that for 3 years." I drove down that evening. The Marshes' house was the neatest on the street. Flower boxes under the windows, the kind of care that comes from people who take pride in a place they've lived a long time. Tom Marsh answered the door in his slippers. Ruth appeared behind him a moment later, drying her hands on a dish towel. I sat at their kitchen table, the way I'd sat at Eleanor's. I put the 1998 document between us and asked Tom if he recognized it. He did. He'd signed it. He and Ruth both had, in the front room of whoever was running the HOA at the time, at a table with coffee and store-bought cookies, believing it was a routine maintenance arrangement they needed to approve to keep the shared dock in good repair. I showed him the second paragraph, the one about ownership, the one that said explicitly that none was transferred. He read it slowly. Then he read it again. Ruth had moved closer. She was reading over his shoulder. Tom looked up. "We've been paying fines," he said, "for our own land." He said it quietly, not rage, not volume, just the specific blankness of a person recalibrating something they'd believed for a long time. Ruth sat down. I didn't say much after that. I didn't need to. I left them with a copy of the 1998 document, their copy, the one they should have been able to read before any of this started, and I drove home along the water. 3 families, Arthur had said back in week 1. She'd sent 3 families out of this development with her fines. I thought about that on the drive back. It wasn't just my beach anymore. It hadn't been maybe for quite a while. My attorney called the next morning. He'd reviewed the lien filing. His assessment was precise. The lien had been filed with reference to fines levied under a claimed authority that had no recorded legal basis. The misrepresentation of the 1998 agreement in the attorney's letter was documentable and significant. He used the phrase, "actionable misrepresentation," and then suggested I not do anything public yet. I told him I wasn't planning to. She filed the lien on a Thursday. By Friday, I'd already spoken to the county attorney's office. And on Saturday morning, Karen scheduled a special HOA meeting for all 96 homeowners. She was going to make this public. I was counting on it. The community rec room held about 60 people comfortably. On Saturday evening, it held 83. Margaret had done her work. The notices had gone out to all 96 households. Special session mandatory attendance, strongly encouraged. Future of community waterfront access. Please bring your concerns. The folding chairs were arranged in rows, facing a table at the front, where 3 board members sat. A projector had been set up. There was a printed handout on every seat. I arrived early and sat in the back corner. Nobody came to speak to me. A few people looked. Most looked away. The handout was 4 pages. Page 1 was a photograph of me, taken from across the beach, the morning Karen had photographed me without asking, the morning she'd called 911. I was standing at the water's edge with my coffee facing the bay. I looked in the photograph exactly like a man standing on his own property. I'm not sure that was the impression she intended. Page 2 was a summary of my violations and the accrued fine total. Pages 3 and 4 were a map. I recognized the original subdivision plat, the one I'd pulled from the county recorder's office, the one that showed Bayshore Access Parcel B as private lot access. But this version was different. In this version, the entire waterfront strip had been shaded in blue and labeled Community Common Area, HOA jurisdiction. The shading was precise, professional looking, the kind of thing that if you hadn't pulled the county's recorded version and held them side by side, you might take at face value. I turned the handout over and looked at the back, blank. I set it face down on the chair beside me. Margaret opened the meeting at 7 o'clock. She had the projector running the same modified map on the wall behind her, larger now filling the whole screen. The blue waterfront strip, impossible to miss. She stood in front of it with the easy authority of a person who had run these meetings for 9 years, and expected them to go the way she planned. "Thank you all for coming," she said. "I want to address something that affects every family in this development." She paused. The room was quiet. "A new homeowner has claimed private ownership of our community waterfront. He has refused to pay association fines, he has refused to comply with community rules, and he is now threatening legal action that could result in 96 families losing access to the waterfront amenity they paid for when they purchased their homes here." She looked at me when she said it. The room followed her eyes. I looked back at her. I didn't move. She turned back to the projector. "This map shows the community waterfront as it has been maintained and governed by this association for 30 years. She clicked to the next slide, my fine history, each violation listed with date and amount. She read several of them aloud, slowly, with the measured gravity of someone presenting evidence at a sentencing. The man in the 3rd row nodded along. 2 women near the window were whispering to each other. Someone near the front had their arms crossed and was looking at the floor. I sat in the back with my file folder on my lap. The deed, the original plat, the 1998 agreement, the attorney letter, the GPS, tagged photographs of the signposts, and I said nothing. Margaret presented for 22 minutes. During those 22 minutes, she used the phrase, "our beach," 7 times, "community property," 4 times, and 30 years, 3 times. She mentioned the 1998 agreement once, describing it as the recorded agreement that formalized HOA ownership of the waterfront. The same 1998 agreement that said in its second paragraph that it did nothing of the sort. The man in the second row from the back. I'd noticed him when I came in, mid-60s, quiet, the careful posture of someone who spent time with numbers, had picked up the handout map and was studying it with a slight frown. He set it down, picked it up again. He glanced toward me once, briefly, and then looked back at the map. When Margaret opened the floor, I raised my hand. She gave me 2 minutes. I stood up, and the room shifted the way rooms shift when the person everyone has been looking at finally speaks. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't show anything from the folder. I asked one question. Margaret, can you provide this room with the recorded deed or title instrument, not the bylaws, not a maintenance agreement, not an internal HOA document? The actual recorded deed showing that the HOA took legal ownership of the waterfront strip. The room was quiet for a moment. Margaret straightened slightly. That's a legal matter currently being handled by our association attorney. What I can tell you is that this beach has been HOA property for 30 years. It has been maintained with HOA funds for 30 years, and the legal basis for our authority is well established. So no deed, I said. Tonight. As I said, our attorney. Thank you, I said, and sat down. Across the room, the Marshes were sitting together near the far wall. Tom had his hands folded on his knees. Ruth was very still. When I sat down, Tom looked at me for a moment, a specific kind of look, and then looked away. Near the front, the man with the numbers posture set down the modified map one more time. The vote came at 8:15. Margaret moved to authorize the board to pursue formal legal action against me, to protect and affirm HOA ownership of community waterfront property. The board seconded it immediately. 54-38. She won the room. She stood at the front with the blue map still on the wall behind her, and she looked like a woman who had run this play before and knew how it ended. The board members beside her were already gathering their papers. I folded my hand out, the modified map, the photograph of me on my own beach, and put it in my folder, with the deed and the original plat, and the 1998 agreement, and the attorney letter, and the GPS-tagged photos of her posts in my soil. I thanked the people near me and left. In the parking lot, footsteps behind me. The man with the numbers posture fell into step at my shoulder. She's never shown that deed, he said quietly. Not once in 9 years. I've been to every meeting. He paused. I'm a retired accountant. I've asked about the waterfront budget line 3 times. I've never gotten a straight answer. I thanked him. He gave me his card. His name was Gerald. I drove home along the water. The bay was black and flat under a clear sky. 3 things had happened in that room that Margaret didn't know about. The first, the Marshes had heard my question and heard her answer. They had heard her say, "Our attorney," where a deed should have been. Tom Marsh had looked at me the way a man looks when something he suspected for a long time has just been confirmed in public. The second, Gerald had spent the last 20 minutes studying a map he knew wasn't right, and he had my phone number now. The third, Margaret had stood in front of 96 homeowners and presented a fabricated county document as official. That document was now in the meeting minutes. It was on record. She walked out of that room thinking it was over. She'd just filed a formal trespass complaint with the police, naming me by address and lot number. That was the last mistake she had left to make. They knocked at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning. 2 officers. One I didn't recognize, older senior patch on his shoulder. The other I did. The younger one from that first morning. The one who had looked at the laminated sign, and then looked at Karen, and then looked at the cabin, with an expression I had filed away. He recognized me at the same moment I recognized him. Something passed between us that wasn't quite acknowledgement, and wasn't quite anything else. The senior officer explained they were following up on a formal trespass complaint filed by the Bayside HOA, naming me by address and lot number, alleging unauthorized occupation of association property. "Come in," I said. I put coffee on and set the file folder on the kitchen table. I didn't perform. I didn't lead with the conclusion. I just laid the documents out in order left to right, the way you'd read them, and walked them through it the same way I'd walked through it myself 3 weeks earlier at the county recorder's office. "This is the recorded deed for this property," I said, "filed with the county in 1963. I slid it across to the senior officer. Let him read. The relevant clause was on the second page. I'd marked it with a small tab. Lot 7, together with riparian rights and exclusive access to the waterfront strip, designated herein as Bayshore Access Parcel B. The senior officer read it again. Set it down carefully the way you set something down when you're not finished with it. I waited. This is the original subdivision plat, I said. Also county recorded same era. I unfolded it across the table. Bayshore Access Parcel B, visible, labeled, drawn as a private access strip attached to individual lot deeds, not shaded, not designated as common area. The younger officer leaned forward slightly. I watched him find the strip on the map. I watched him find my lot. I watched him find the label. The senior officer set the deed next to the plat, looked at both. I let the silence run for a moment. Then I put two documents side by side in the space between us. On the left, the HOA attorney's letter. The paragraph that read, transferred to HOA common ownership via recorded agreement in 1998. On the right, the 1998 document itself. The paragraph that read, this agreement constitutes a maintenance and management arrangement only and does not constitute, imply, or affect a transfer of ownership of any property interest in the designated waterfront parcels. I didn't explain it. I just let them read. The younger officer picked up the attorney's letter, looked at the 1998 document, looked back at the letter, set it down. The senior officer said quietly, these say opposite things. They do, I said. Then I put the photographs on the table. GPS tagged, time-stamped the HOA signs installed in the soil of Bayshore Access Parcel B. Post-hole hardware 8 inches into my deeded lot. The wide shot, showing both posts relative to my cabin. The close-up of the zip ties and the laminate. The younger officer picked up the wide shot. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked out the kitchen window toward the beach where the signs were still standing. I said, the trespass complaint the HOA filed names me as occupying association property. That property, Bayshore Access Parcel B, does not exist in county records as association property. It has never been deeded to the HOA. The only recorded instrument they cite is the 1998 agreement, and you've just read what that agreement actually says. The senior officer looked at his partner. His partner looked at the plat, then back at the photographs. Give us a moment, the senior officer said. They stepped out to the porch. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the bay. The heron was in the shallows, 40 yards out, working the same stretch it always worked at its own pace, in its own time, completely indifferent to anything happening above the waterline. When they came back in, the senior officer stood at the table and looked at the documents one more time. Not reviewing, just looking. The way you look at something when you want to be exact about what you say next. The trespass complaint filed against you, he said, cannot be sustained. There is no recorded ownership interest supporting the association's claim to this parcel. He paused. We'll document that in our report. He picked up the photographs of the signposts. These the installation on your deeded lot without permission or notice? That's a civil trespass matter on their end. You'll want to note that with an attorney if you haven't already. I have, I said. The younger officer looked at me for a moment before they left. Not the uncertain look from that first morning when he'd been watching Karen explain things and trying to figure out which version of the story was true. A different look. The look of someone who has finished reading and reached the last page. Have a good morning, he said. I thanked them both and watched them walk to the car from the window. The report was filed by noon. A police report is a public record in this county. It exists. It says what it says permanently, regardless of what anyone does afterward. What this one said, what it would continue to say, filed under the HOA's own complaint reference number, initiated by their own formal request, was that the trespass complaint against the owner of Lot 7, Bayshore Access Parcel B, had been closed with no action due to the absence of any recorded ownership interest supporting the association's claim. Karen had called 911 on that first morning to remove me from my own beach. She had filed a formal trespass complaint to finish the job. Both were now on the county record. Both said the same thing in the end. The HOA had no claim. She had picked up the phone twice and handed me 2 official documents that said she was wrong. Word reached the HOA board by mid-afternoon. I don't know exactly how Gerald probably, or one of the 38 who had voted against the lawsuit motion, and had been waiting for something to change the room. The board member who had co-signed the trespass complaint called Karen within the hour. Their conversation, I was told later, was short. By evening, the association attorney had been notified. By the next morning, he had reviewed the police report, the deed, the plat, and the side-by-side comparison of his own letter against the 1998 document. He withdrew the lien filing before close of business. I was sitting on the dock when my attorney called to tell me. I thanked him, hung up, and sat there for a while. The water was going gold, the way it does in the late afternoon, the same color it had been that first Tuesday morning, when Karen had walked across the sand and told me to leave. The HOA beach sign was still zip-tied to the post in the sand 8 feet away. Not for much longer. The county attorney's office sent their letter on a Thursday. 1 page. Formal language precise and unhurried. The substance: the office had reviewed the submitted documentation and confirmed that Bayshore Access Parcel B held no recorded ownership interest in favor of the Bayside Homeowners Association. The HOA was formally notified to remove all unauthorized signage and hardware from the privately deeded parcel within 30 days at their own expense. A copy of the letter was entered into the county's property dispute file, cross-referenced with the police report filed under the HOA's own complaint number. The trespass complaint was formally closed and expunged from my record. The police report documenting the HOA's false claim of ownership stayed exactly where it was: permanent, public, filed under their reference number, accessible to anyone who asked. My attorney called to walk me through it. I thanked him, wrote down the relevant case numbers, and put them in the folder with everything else. The emergency board meeting happened 10 days later. 41 homeowners had signed the petition requesting it, 23 of whom had received fines from the HOA in the past 3 years, for things that, in several cases, turned out to have the same problem my beach did. Enforcement actions taken under claimed authority that the association's own founding documents didn't actually support. Gerald had organized it. Quietly, methodically, the way a retired accountant organizes things, with a spreadsheet, a timeline, and a numbered list of questions that Margaret couldn't answer any better at an emergency meeting than she'd answered at the last one. The vote to remove Margaret from the board presidency was 67 to 21. She didn't speak after the result was announced. She gathered her papers, the modified plat, the fine schedule binder, the 9-year stack of compliance photographs, and she left. No scene, no final statement, just the sound of the door closing on a room that had already moved on. Gerald was elected interim president by acclamation. His first motion that the modified plat Margaret had presented at the previous meeting be formally noted in the board minutes as an inaccurate representation of the county's recorded plat. The motion passed without objection. It went into the record, permanent, alongside everything else. His second motion, that the $2,850 in fines levied against my property be voided in writing and removed from the association's accounts receivable. That passed too. The Marshes situation took a little longer, but not much. Gerald's spreadsheet had identified their fine history as part of a broader pattern waterfront adjacent enforcement actions with the same foundational problem. Combined with Eleanor's account and the 1998 agreement's actual language, the number came to $6,400, collected from original waterfront lot owners over 3 years, under a claimed authority the HOA had never legally possessed. The new board voted to return it. I wasn't in the room when Tom Marsh got the letter, but Eleanor called me that evening and told me Ruth had cried again, different this time from the way she'd cried over the fine notices. Tom had read the letter out loud at their kitchen table. Then he'd folded it and put it in his shirt pocket and kept it there for the rest of the day. 3 other original waterfront lot owners contacted me over the following 2 weeks, having heard through the development's particular version of word of mouth that their original deeds might be worth reading carefully. I referred them to my attorney and let him handle it. That chapter was theirs to write. The HOA's legal defense costs were disclosed at the following month's regular board meeting. Gerald presented the line item without editorial comment. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then someone asked if the figure could be broken into a monthly summary. It could. Gerald showed them the spreadsheet. The new board voted to publish a quarterly financial report going forward. All line items, all expenses, open to any homeowner who asked. The work crew came on a Wednesday morning while I was inside. I heard them the particular sound of metal posts being worked loose from compacted sand, the clank of hardware going into a truck bed. It didn't take long. They were gone before I finished my second cup of coffee. I walked down to the beach when the sound stopped. The signs were gone. The posts were gone. What remained were 2 holes in the sand, clean-edged, 8 inches deep, already beginning to soften at the rim, where the dry sand was starting to drift back in. They stood about 4 feet apart, exactly where Karen had planted them on the day she'd decided to put her claim into the ground. I looked at them for a while. Then I went back inside, poured a third cup, brought a folding chair down to the waterfront, and sat. The bay was doing what it always did, going silver in the early light. The heron working the shallows 40 yards out. The same stretch it always worked. The dock groaned once, the way old docks do. The screen on the porch still had the long diagonal tear in it. I kept meaning to fix that. The manila envelope was in the drawer in the second bedroom. The deed inside it. The folder with everything else. The plat, the 1998 agreement, the attorney, letters, the GPS-tagged photographs, the police report. Numbers was on the shelf above the filing cabinet. I didn't need to carry it anymore. She called 911 to remove me from my own beach. That call is still on file with the county. So is everything else: the complaint, the report, the finding, the record of what she claimed and what the county said back. The cabin's still standing. The beach is still mine. And Margaret, well, Margaret has a lot of time now. She's not on the board anymore. The heron moved 3 steps to the left and held, waiting the way herons wait, perfectly still, absolutely patient, certain of something the water hadn't revealed yet. I drank my coffee.